In the summer of 1915, the Russian army was retreating across Poland, and it was retreating in silence. Not the silence of discipline, the silence of empty guns. Batteries that had fired hundreds of rounds a day in the first months of the war were now rationed to a handful of shells. Officers wrote home that German artillery would pound their trenches for hours, and they were forbidden to answer because every shell had to be saved for something worse. Fresh recruits arrived at the front and were told to wait for a rifle until another man died and dropped one. Russia was running out of shells, and an empire that cannot arm its soldiers does not remain an empire for long. 1,000 miles from the front, in the ministries and drawing rooms of Petrograd, everyone was asking the same question: who is to blame? Generals blamed ministers, ministers blamed factories. The newspapers hunted for spies and traitors and found them, real or invented. And through it all, one name kept surfacing in the whispers, a name with no military rank, no government office, no official connection to the war at all. The name of a ballerina. She was the most celebrated dancer in the Russian Empire. She was also the former mistress of Tsar Nicholas II, and by 1915, a remarkable number of people in Petrograd believed that this woman had her hands deep inside the machinery that armed or failed to arm the Russian army. Her name was Mathilde Kschessinska. Was she a convenient scapegoat for a collapsing regime, or had a woman from the imperial stage really reached into the heart of Russia's war machine? To answer that, we have to go back 25 years to a graduation dinner and a seating arrangement personally approved by a czar. March 1890. The Imperial Theater School in St. Petersburg is holding its graduation performance, and the audience is not an ordinary one. Tsar Alexander III has arrived with his family, including his son and heir, the 21-year-old Tsarevich Nicholas. Among the graduating dancers is a small, dark-eyed 17-year-old named Mathilde Kschessinska. Ballet is the family trade. Her father, Felix, a Pole, has danced on the imperial stage for decades and is considered the finest mazurka dancer in Russia. According to Mathilde's own memoirs, when the performance ended, the enormous Tsar looked over the assembled graduates and asked, "Where is Kschessinska?" She was brought forward, and Alexander delivered a sentence she would repeat for the rest of her very long life: "Be the glory and the adornment of our ballet." Then, at the supper that followed, the Emperor of all the Russians personally seated the teenage dancer next to his son. Whatever Alexander intended by it, a joke, a compliment, or something more calculated, the effect was immediate. Nicholas was shy, gentle, and painfully aware of his future. Mathilde was ambitious, quick, and entirely unintimidated. Within 2 years, the friendship had become a love affair. The heir to the Russian throne began visiting her in the evenings. He gave her gifts and eventually a house of her own on the English Prospect. In his private diary, he called her Little K. For a young man being slowly crushed by the weight of an empire, her drawing room was one of the only places on earth where he could simply be Nicky. But both of them understood the arithmetic. A Tsarevich could love a dancer. He could never marry one. In the spring of 1894, Nicholas became engaged to a German princess, Alex of Hesse, the future Empress Alexandra. That same year, his father died, and the shy young man from the graduation dinner became Tsar Nicholas II. The affair was over. And this is usually where the story of a royal mistress ends: a discreet pension, a respectable marriage, a quiet disappearance from history. Mathilde Kschessinska had a different plan. According to her memoirs, Nicholas told her at their parting that she could always turn to him directly and ask for anything. And, she wrote, he entrusted her care to one of his own relatives, Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich. Remember that name. 20 years later, it will sit at the center of the biggest military scandal in the empire. Losing Nicholas as a lover, Mathilde discovered, did not mean losing the Romanovs. On stage, she rose with astonishing speed, helped, her rivals muttered, by exactly the connections everyone suspected. She became prima ballerina, and then claimed a title almost no Russian dancer had ever held, prima ballerina absoluta. The directorate of the imperial theaters resented her. It didn't matter. She had learned early that in an autocracy, there is only one audience that counts. One episode became legend in theatrical Petersburg. In 1901, the director of the imperial theaters, Prince Volkonsky, fined Kschessinska over an unauthorized costume change. The sum was trivial. Days later, the fine was canceled from above, and shortly afterward, Volkonsky resigned. Every official in the city understood the message. This woman outranks her own superiors. To file a complaint against her was to file a complaint against the dynasty itself. Offstage, her private life wove even deeper into the imperial family. Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich, the man Nicholas had asked to look after her, fell genuinely and permanently in love with her. He managed her money, protected her interests, and treated her as an unofficial wife. She never married him. Then a second Grand Duke entered the picture, Andrei Vladimirovich, a first cousin of the Tsar, younger, elegant, and equally devoted. In 1902, Mathilde gave birth to a son, Vladimir. Which Grand Duke was the father remained a question politely left unanswered, possibly even by Mathilde herself. Both men stayed at her side. Petersburg society was scandalized, fascinated, and increasingly afraid of her. By 1906, she had built herself a palace, a gleaming Art Nouveau mansion on Kronversky Prospect, with electric lighting throughout, a wine cellar. Her memoirs even mention a small cowshed so that she could have fresh milk every morning. Admirers showered her benefit performances with jewelry. Her collection of diamonds, pearls, and Fabergé pieces was said to rival those of Grand Duchesses. She held no title, she held no office, but she possessed something more valuable than either: private, unrecorded, personal access to the ruling family of an absolute monarchy, a world where a word spoken over champagne could outweigh a ministry's report. Which raises the question that would eventually consume her reputation. What happens when the man who adores a ballerina is also the man who decides which guns the Russian army buys? Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich was a grandson of Tsar Nicholas I, and unlike many Romanov princes, he took his profession seriously. That profession was artillery. He rose to become Inspector General of Artillery, the highest authority in the branch, with sweeping influence over the main artillery directorate, the body that tested new weapons, approved designs, and placed the orders. In the years before the First World War, as every European power raced to rearm, the decisions crossing his desk were worth fortunes. Not fortunes in the ordinary sense, fortunes in the sense of entire industries. Two giants competed for Russia's artillery contracts. From Germany, Krupp, the most famous arms maker on earth. From France, Schneider-Creusot, which had cleverly partnered with the Putilov works in St. Petersburg, the largest private factory in Russia. France was Russia's ally and, crucially, Russia's banker. Loans from Paris kept the imperial budget breathing. So there were strategic reasons to favor Schneider. But among Russian artillery officers, an uncomfortable claim kept resurfacing: that in comparative trials, Krupp's designs had performed as well or better, and the contracts went to Schneider and Putilov anyway. Was that alliance politics, industrial strategy, or something else? Here is where Mathilde Kschessinska re-enters the story, because the Inspector General of Artillery spent his evenings at her mansion on Kronversky Prospect, and so at various times did Putilov directors, French industrial representatives, financiers, and senior officers. Her salon was one of the rooms where the worlds of money, weapons, and the dynasty physically met. There is nothing criminal about a dinner party, but Imperial Russia had no parliamentary control over military spending, no independent audit, no free press with access to the books. In a system like that, no one could say where hospitality ended and business began. The only thing visible from the outside was the result: Schneider and Putilov kept winning, and the ballerina kept getting richer. Even before the war, the jokes had begun, that her diamonds were commissions, that Russian artillery policy was decided not at the ministry, but in a dancer's boudoir. Foreign diplomats noted the gossip in their diaries. It was ugly, unproven, and contained for the moment within the drawing rooms of the capital. Rumors like that need a catastrophe to become accusations. In August 1914, the catastrophe arrived. Like every great power, Russia went to war in 1914 expecting a short campaign. Its planners had stockpiled roughly 1,000 shells per field gun, a reserve calculated to last for months of fighting. The guns burned through it in weeks. Nobody in Europe had imagined what industrial war would consume, but other nations could retool faster. Russia's factories were fewer, its machine tools were imported, its skilled workers were scarce, its railways were thin. Orders placed abroad drowned in delays. By the winter of 1914, frontline commanders were sending telegrams that read less like military correspondence and more like cries for help. Give us shells. In May 1915, at Gorlitz-Tarnów, the German and Austro-Hungarian armies massed their artillery and simply blew a hole through the Russian front. What followed became known as the Great Retreat. Poland was abandoned. Warsaw fell in August. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, and millions of refugees clogged the roads leading east. Soldiers' letters and officers' memoirs from that summer repeat the same unbearable scene. German guns firing for hours, Russian guns rationed to a few shells a day, infantry ordered to hold trenches with bayonets against artillery. The phrase shell hunger entered the Russian language. A disaster on this scale demanded traitors, and the empire supplied them. In March 1915, Colonel Mikhailovich, a gendarme officer with unlucky friendships, was hanged for espionage after a trial so thin that historians still describe him as a scapegoat. In June, the Minister of War, Sukhomlinov, was dismissed in disgrace. Later, he would be arrested, the living symbol of corruption and unpreparedness. The Empress was whispered about as the German woman. A Siberian faith healer named Rasputin was said to control appointments at the highest level. And in this fever, in the corridors of the Duma, in officers' messes, in bread lines, the old Petersburg gossip about the ballerina detonated into something far larger. The story now went like this. The shells are missing because the contracts were sold. The contracts were sold because the artillery department was for sale, and everyone claimed to know where the money had ended up, in the jewelry boxes of a mansion on Kronvertsky Prospect. Mathilde Kschessinska, prima ballerina absoluta, former mistress of the Tsar, mistress of the Inspector General of Artillery, had become something no dancer had ever been before. A national explanation for a lost war.
So let's do what wartime Petrograd never did. Let's separate what we actually know from what was alleged, from what was never proven. What we know. Sergei Mikhailovich held supreme authority over Russian artillery for years.
Mathilde was his mistress, and he managed her fortune. Schneider and Putilov won enormous contracts amid disputed trials. Mathilde was spectacularly, visibly rich, and the shell crisis was real. It broke the Russian front in 1915. What was alleged? That Kschessinska took a percentage for steering contracts, that manufacturers courted her to reach the Grand Duke, that she meddled in appointments inside the artillery administration, that she and Sergei Mikhailovich had, in effect, privatized a branch of the war ministry. What was never proven? Any of it. No ledger, no contract, no bank record, no witness testimony ever surfaced that documented a bribe. And here is the detail that matters most. After the monarchy fell in 1917, the revolutionary government ransacked the old regime's secrets with vengeful enthusiasm. Its investigators interrogated ministers and generals. Sukhomlinov was put on trial. If there was ever an easy, popular target, It was the Tsar's former mistress, and yet no charge against her was ever brought to court. Her own memoirs, written decades later, deny everything. Memoirs are self-interested, of course, but the silence of her enemies' archives is much harder to dismiss. And there is context that wartime Russia had no patience for. Every major power ran short of shells in 1915. In Britain, the shell scandal made front pages and helped bring down a government. France rationed, Germany rationed. The shortage was born of a universal miscalculation about industrial war. Russia's version was simply the deadliest because Russia's industry was the weakest. No ballerina was required to produce that outcome. But before we acquit her entirely, one more honest step. Even if Mathilde Kschessinska never touched a single corrupt ruble, the world that made the accusation believable was completely real. It was a world where the man commanding artillery procurement shared his evenings, his finances, and his loyalty with a private individual. Where arms manufacturers socialized at her table. Where no institution, no parliament, no court, no newspaper had the power to draw a line between intimacy and influence and check which side of it anyone stood on. The rumor was plausible because the structure was scandalous. Autocracy asked 170 million subjects to simply trust that bloodlines, bedrooms, and budgets would never mix. By 1915, they had stopped trusting.
In February 1917, the empire that had survived Napoleon collapsed in about a week. Bread riots in Petrograd became mutinies. Mutinies became revolution. Nicholas II abdicated in a railway carriage. To the crowds, Kschessinska's mansion was not a home. It was an address for everything they hated: luxury, favoritism, the invisible corruption of the court. Mathilde fled with little more than a handbag, leaving behind the palace, most of the jewels, and the life she had spent 25 years constructing. What happened to the house next is one of history's most theatrical ironies. The Bolsheviks seized it and made it their headquarters, and in April 1917, when Lenin returned to Russia, he addressed the revolutionary crowds again and again from its balcony. The balcony of the Tsar's former mistress became the pulpit of the revolution. Mathilde, astonishingly, sued, and in the spring of 1917, a Petrograd court actually ruled in her favor, ordering the Bolsheviks to vacate her property. They ignored the ruling completely, and that, in its own way, was the true announcement that old Russia was gone. A country where court orders mean nothing has already chosen a different future. She escaped south with her son and spent the Civil War drifting through the Caucasus between advancing and retreating armies. In February 1920, from the port of Novorossiysk, she boarded a ship and left Russia forever. The men of her story did not escape. On the night of July 16th to 17th, 1918, Nicholas II, the shy Tsarevich from the graduation dinner, was shot with his wife and children in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Barely 24 hours later, near the town of Alapayevsk, the Bolsheviks executed another group of Romanovs. Among them was Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich, the man who had run Russia's artillery and who had loved Mathilde Kschessinska without conditions for a quarter of a century. He reportedly resisted, was shot, and his body was thrown down a mine shaft. Months later, when white forces retook the area and recovered the bodies, investigators reported a detail that belongs in fiction. In the dead Grand Duke's hand was a small gold medallion. Inside it, a portrait of Mathilde and an engraving of her nickname, Mala. Mathilde herself lived on and on. In 1921, she married Grand Duke Andrei in Cannes, finally becoming, by marriage, a Romanov princess. The fabulous fortune was gone. In 1929, she opened a ballet studio in Paris and spent 3 decades teaching. Among the students who passed through her classes was the future British legend Margot Fonteyn. She published her memoirs, defending her name to the last page. She died in December 1971, a few months short of her 100th birthday. She had outlived the empire, the revolution, the founders of the Soviet state, and very nearly everyone who had ever accused her. So, was she guilty? The honest answer is that no proof ever surfaced, and historians still argue about how much influence she truly had. Perhaps she was a broker of contracts. Perhaps she was merely a rich woman standing near powerful men at the worst possible moment in history. But maybe guilty or innocent is the wrong question, because the scandal was never really evidence about Mathilde Kschessinska. It was evidence about Russia. By 1915, millions of Russians found it entirely believable that their soldiers were dying without shells because of a ballerina's jewelry box. Think about what that means. When a society is ready to believe that a dancer runs its war machine from her drawing room, that society has already delivered its verdict on the people in charge. The trust died 2 years before the dynasty did. In the end, only one piece of physical evidence ever emerged from the entire affair, and it was pulled from the bottom of a Siberian mine shaft in a dead man's hand. Not a contract, not a ledger. A small gold medallion with a dancer's portrait inside. Whatever else was or wasn't true, that much was. To his final second, the man who commanded Russia's guns loved Mathilde Kschessinska. Everything else, the empire simply chose to believe.